Hey, Andy.
Hey, Jed, how are you?
I'm doing terrific. Nice to see you again.
It's good to see you. I understand you're on the run from the law down in Mexico or something like that.
Uh, it's my wife's and my anniversary, and so we're down here in Oaxaca, Mexico, a place that's been on our bucket list for a very long time. It started with my students in LA. I had a significant number of them that were from Oaxaca, and I still stay in contact with a lot of them, and they check in. You always said, Jed, you were going to go to Oaxaca. Have you been there yet? No, I haven't. No, I haven't. Well, now I can finally say that I've made it. We're having an incredible time. We're balancing, we're having some weeks of work with 1 week at the beach. That will be true anniversary. But it's awesome to be in Oaxaca. I don't know, how familiar are you with the history of teacher unions here and all of that, Andy?
I'm a little familiar. I'm familiar with that part of Mexico because my sister-in-law lived there for a while, but I'm familiar with the teachers unions relatively casually, except I understand that they make ours look like pussycats.
Well, I can't talk for the whole country, but I will say that it was our second day here. We're walking around just in love with the city. It's just a magical place. And all of a sudden, there's a teacher union protest coming down the main square. And it was just striking. And you had to wait for probably almost 10 minutes for this procession to get past you. Of course, I was interested. I wanted to read all their slogans and all those kinds of things too. That night, we had a guy who walked us around to orient us to the city. His mom had been a teacher during 2006, which is when Oaxaca's union really was really on the radar screen.
Yeah.
And I think, hearing the story from this young man's perspective, it really presents the teachers and the unions at that moment in a very heroic light. Oaxaca is one of the poorest states in Mexico, and the pueblos around the central city are some of the poorest of the poor places that you will find. And the quality of education in those places was just not acceptable. So there was a real nobility to what the teachers were trying to do, which was to force the central government to put a volume of resources into public education that would pay greater respect to these kids that were basically not getting an education. And during that time, literally, they closed down the central city of Oaxaca. There were like 80,000 teachers on strike. The police force was only like 3,000 or 4,000. But teachers literally lost their lives as people tried to break up these demonstrations. I mean, it was a major conflict. Ultimately, I think in 2006, people would say the teachers won. They prevailed and they got the additional resources. But there's this underbelly to what they've done as well, which is around work rules. And the idea that if you have a job, you can pass the job to your own family members or to other people of your choosing. That there's really no standards whatsoever for getting a teaching job. Just the calendar and the amount of days that kids are in class, these are all limited, by this same force. And so it just makes me think that Oaxaca right now puts in repose, the teacher union matter in the United States as well. In the United States, it's over a longer time frame. If it wasn't for the teachers in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, really coming together and becoming a force to force higher amounts of investment in public education, goodness knows where we would be. It was a totally noble undertaking. But then once the resources are flowing, the work rules are so counter to the needs of kids that it's really hard to have anything other than a feeling of frustration for what they're currently doing.
Say a little bit more about what are the issues this time? Like because I do remember that strike, and it was noteworthy. It seemed like the structure of education in many ways in Mexico is very similar to what you see throughout sort of Central and South America, which is very bifurcated, and the elites are sort of operating on a different plane in terms of how they access education. But what's the issue? What are the issues now? Is it the same stuff still not resolved, or is it new issues?
I don't really know, Andy. I don't want to oversell how much I'm keyed into this. It seems as though these are legacy issues. They keep fighting in a very similar way. Our host a couple of days ago was saying that kids still will miss dozens of days of school each year as the union just takes days off and occupies the central square and just reiterates what their demands are. One of the things that came up in this conversation is just, first of all, how difficult it is to be a teacher in some of these more indigenous areas. And yet it's very much like you find in the United States. Who do you think ends up going to the most difficult posts? The young teachers, the teachers with no experience. And as you get older and more seniority, what do? You gravitate toward the parts of the city that are considered most attractive. And of course, the more affluent Mexicans are living in those communities. So we find a structural way for those that need the best education to be most deprived of it. And it seems as though these seniority rights, are extremely important to the union. They're not willing to compromise on those things. They're also not willing to have higher levels of pay in the difficult communities or the more challenging communities to live in. And so these restrictions that they insist on translate into the highest need kids, unfortunately, being the least well served.
Well, it's weird. That sounds a little familiar to me. That last
totally.
bit, you don't have to travel to Mexico if you want to experience that. You can.
It was funny because when I was explaining this with our guide a couple of days ago, I didn't tell the story of senior teachers or teachers moving from more challenging schools to more attractive ones over time in the context of Mexico. I talked about it in the context of Los Angeles and different schools. And he's like, oh, that's exactly how it works here, except the tough places to first teach in are in the indigenous areas and the more attractive ones closer to central Oaxaca. So he made the connection, not me, to the similarity between the Mexican context and the American one.
Interesting.
Anyway, I think it puts our work in just really interesting repose. Sometimes I think we can see our own world, by looking at what's happening in other countries. That's why I tend to write about this at Charter Folk. It's just, hey, we can see it perhaps when we look at another country where we've grown so used to what we see in our own that sometimes it's not fresh and we can't even realize what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I like international work, and I used to do some of it when my kids were growing up. I didn't do much because I didn't want the travel that's associated with it. I didn't want to be away from them that much, and now I'm starting to edge back towards some of that because it's really interesting. I do worry though, like it is a place where just like correlation, causation, and sort of monocausality kind of errors just thrive. Like people go to these places, they see one thing that works. So like they go to the Netherlands and they see that they've got like a choice system, and they come back and are like, see, you can have choice in a highly religious, saturated kind of environment, and it's fine with absolutely no knowledge of like the history of the Netherlands and how they got to that point and the other aspects of the system. We saw obviously the big example of our sector, which Tim Daly recently revisited, was Finland, which was like a whole industry and like taking like one thing and decontextualizing and being like, this is what we should do here. And so I think it's very valuable, but it's also, you have to be a skeptical consumer of this.
Yeah. And I think from a charter school perspective, you see different levels of receptiveness in different countries. New Zealand right now, it's had an ebb and flow. It had a moment where the whole charter school experiment almost died, but it's been revived and it's growing and thriving in New Zealand for sure. But like in Latin American countries where labor tends to be very strong, I mean, we have charter schools in Puerto Rico right now, but the opposition that charter schools face in Puerto Rico, it's just like, oh my gosh, impossible to almost imagine. When I was down in Colombia for my brother's illness, I had a chance to learn about the charter schools in Bogota. And I recently highlighted that there was a study about the Bogota schools that came out. They're doing an incredible job. They're doing an incredible job relative to traditional public schools. But the blowback that they're contending with, it's just, it makes our work look like, child's play.
Right. Well, that's Puerto Rico too. It's just a really entrenched set of resistance factors to reform, and it's just really difficult for reformers down there in general. This is amazing though. What are we, like 8 minutes? We're 8 minutes in and we haven't talked about speaking of like being skeptical and also like the teachers union's favorite people, we haven't talked about Corey DeAngelis yet.
Yeah, I wanted to congratulate. First of all, thank you for what you wrote. I thought, because first of all, I got to tell you, I hadn't even heard of it, and so you brought it to my attention. But then I thought the way that you wrote about it was really, really smart. But you want to elaborate on, or perhaps even for our audience that might not be keyed into it yet, talk about this whole situation.
Yeah, and I'd recommend, as we're recording this, the 74 has a story out advancing the whole issue a little bit, which I would commend. And I mean, essentially, he was a self-described school choice evangelist. I mean, you could certainly say he was like a very strident school choice activist, and he had a very particular style. He was extremely combative, active on social media, a real shit stirrer. And he was one of these people who used like culture war frames to go after the public schools. And some of the issues he picked, we can talk about like how much of it's hypocrisy and how much of it's like just people disagree. But like he certainly stoked a culture of fear. He didn't help with those, people who want to see sort of a de-escalation of the culture wars. He certainly didn't help with any of that. And it's come to light that he also acted in a lot of porn, apparently, on a website called Gay Hoopla, which I generally am pretty much, I do my homework, I go to primary sources and all that. But on this one, I looked at a few screen grabs on social media and was like, okay, I get the idea. So I haven't actually gone through all this. But my initial reaction was actually like, because he's so combative and everything else, like he seems ripe for a hit. There's these parts of the internet where all people do all day is argue and trench warfare. And so I was like, this could be a deep fake or just like a look-alike. I was actually a little skeptical initially, but immediately like places where he has formal relationships like the American Federation for Children and the Hoover Institution took his site off. And I asked around the few folks I know and people were like, oh yeah, there's something to this. This is real. And so that's kind of where we are. And the 74 advanced the story substantially, something I hinted at in my blog post, but I didn't have a full understanding of, so I only hinted at it, was that this hit came from the right. And so it was sort of intra-right fratricide around some issues around school choice and government regulation. And there's some folks who think that having the government involved in things like ESAs and so forth is a real threat to liberty and to homeschooling and so forth. That that sort of faction of the school choice world has always been out there. And I think on like so many issues, like this is true on guns, people don't understand often the full contour that like the NRA, like you may find them frustrating, but they've got a bunch of groups on their right flank that objectively make the NRA look a little bit more moderate, right? And it's the same thing with school choice. You've got these folks out there who, I remember when I used to report out stuff on homeschools and homeschoolers, you would talk to people who just, they were against, like there was efforts to like let homeschool kids play sports on public school sports teams. And they were against that. They're like, no, that's really bad because it creates entanglement. It's like, they want to hide it all like from the other side. Those are the people who apparently were frustrated with some of the stuff Corey was doing, found some pictures, and it led to stuff. And they fed this website that because they came out on a very sort of far right website that I'd never heard of before this episode.
Well, the story kind of the story dragged it into what does this mean as far as school choice goes within a splinter area of the choice world that a lot of us are not that keyed into. I thought that your first post was great in that you kind of looked at it from the kind of social issue perspective, which I thought was probably the place that we'll end up coming back to long term as well for those of us that are just interested in general interests.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can see in like the AFT is trying to make it into a school choice story now and so forth, and that's politics. That's what they're going to do. But I don't think it's these are human failing stories. Like, look, every time a teachers union leader gets indicted for fraud, I don't think that's a teachers union's story. People get indicted for fraud in like a variety of sectors and situations. That's a human failing story. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's the same thing here. I do think though, it does have one like sort of like subtle lesson that's not unique to school choice, but just around like edu celebrities. Like I think people like it was striking to me how that the media never vetted this guy, and that's like
Yeah.
the bottom has fallen out of media. It's a tough business right now, but it seems surprising that there hadn't been like a little more vetting of something like this, and that struck me. And then also like people's willingness to fall in love with like these combative types, and
Yeah.
like you shouldn't fall in love with the ideas, fall in love with your North Star, but like if we see this in politics too, if you fall in love with people, you're inevitably like some of them will disappoint in various ways. Maybe not quite as dramatic as this, but in various ways.
Well, I was going to bring up Corey's last major piece with you anyway, which was his analysis of the Arizona voucher program. And he basically, and also like Matt Ladner went after me too, because I've been highlighting.
Yeah, hang on. Before we get to that, let me just ask you a question. Before we get, I want to talk about all that, but did you ever meet this guy?
Never did.
Yeah, I didn't
I
either.
did have, I had several people who encouraged me to meet with him and those guys. And I wasn't like strongly resistant. It just wasn't a priority of mine. And so it never really happened. Part of it was I just had like kind of that intuitive sense too. It's just he's a figure that's just very incendiary, and I don't know enough to like welcome him onto the Charter Folk platform or something like that. And without that level of knowledge, I just kept what turned out to be a distance.
Yeah, no, I never met him either. And like, it sounds like your instinct may have been like something about him always seemed off. I wrote about this in the blog post. I didn't think anything like this, but like something just didn't. And there was a podcast he did recently with Nick Gillespie of Reason. And like, and like the beginning of it is almost like painful with the host Gillespie trying to like get this guy like just off of sort of script and message and performative talking points. And that podcast at the time kind of like, it just kind of underscored for me, like something just didn't sit right. It was like a performance or a shtick, which again, I think maybe should have made people a little more skeptical. And I do hope there's some reporting on like, when did people know this? And like, like how much were people willing to, because this guy did trade in some pretty anti-LGBT themes. And again, as I said earlier,
right,
like, or like not everything. Like he took some positions on some culture war issues that like plenty of gay people would take, or plenty of transgender people. So it's not like across the board, but he definitely traded in some pretty divisive stuff around like the context and climate he was creating, and some of the things he said. This sort of they're coming for your kids kind of vibe, and
yeah.
And there should be some accountability for that. When did people know about this and so forth? So I'm hoping this gets reported out a little bit more.
Yeah. On the one hand, I want to just keep the focus there and don't let it become a story that it's actually not. At the same time, and this is what I wanted to ask you about this Arizona story. I think it's important that we deeply trust the people that are doing the analysis here. This is basic economics. This is adding and subtracting. And ultimately, you can get to the bottom of the answer of whether or not the choice system in Arizona is bankrupting the state or not. And my first response was, well, I should probably trust his analysis. I have no reason to distrust it. It made me want to reach out to Matt Ladner and just say, hey, do I fundamentally have this wrong? Is, in fact, the Arizona choice system economically sustainable? But then when I see these other compromises that Corey has made in other areas of his life, it makes me go back and look at his piece that he wrote about Arizona and wonder whether he was willing to cut corners or misrepresent, in that context as well. Do you have any similar?
I don't know. I mean, look, he may not have been playing straight pool, as it turns out. But like, I feel like on the Arizona thing, it's more, I think everybody has an agenda here. And so you should be skeptical. The choice people have an agenda in saying, hey, there's nothing to see here. And this is not. And some of the points they raise are correct. So like in Arizona, the way things work, to access some of these funds under like ESAs, you have to forego other tax credits so that there's going to be costs and savings. They're not all wrong, but they have an interest in saying, much as we've discussed with the musical chairs thing, they have an interest in saying, hey, there's nothing to see here. Don't worry.
Right.
On the other hand, like the governor, Hobbs, and the Democrats have an interest in like hyping this as much as they possibly can and coming up with like the most robust assumptions to get to the biggest numbers to scare the bejesus out of everybody. And I think the answer at this point is we don't quite know. What we can be sure of is you've got two fairly powerful forces here, a cost structure that is going to be an issue, and a very, very popular program and and we've essentially created an entitlement that's very popular. And those two things are in collision with one another. I think it's just too soon to tell exactly how it's going to play out, how people are going to take their options and how they're going to think about that. And is it all going to be, or the bulk of it be people who aren't previous public school participants, or will there be more movement? And we won't know that for a little bit as till we see that. And the behavior stuff on this, I think anyone who's followed school choice for a while should be like Jason. The behavior stuff on this always plays out in like unpredictable ways. And so I just think it's too early for like some of the grand pronouncements we're hearing from all sides. I say that with the huge caveat is I haven't read Corey DeAngelis' stuff on this, but I have read the stuff from the state and some of the other things. And so I take it all with a grain of salt, because I just think it's too soon. And people are still largely arguing from their priors, and there's a lot of agendas on all sides.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I'm not saying it's not an issue, and I'm also not saying that like this idea that it's going to absolutely decimate these budgets. It could play out in some different ways. We're going to see this in some other states. We're also going to see this, Jed, as you know, is a huge natural experiment. In some places, you've got some degree of means testing. In some places, you don't.
Right.
In some places, you have these different kinds of programs that are going to interact with one another. In some places, you don't. I just think it's going to be like the one problem is the way some of these are set up. We're going to be able to evaluate some of the descriptive and behavioral aspects, but we're going to really struggle to evaluate some of the outcomes. And so which in education means it will forever be a somewhat political debate based on people's priors. We won't get, at least in the near term, we're not going to get some of the evidence that might be really satisfying to help figure out and validate or falsify various claims people are making. But we will be able to do on the finance side. That's real, and in a few years we'll have a really good sense of what's going on.
Well, I just wonder, is this something that Bellwether is going to wade into? Are you going to host a debate, or can you get to the bottom of the economics here, such that those of us that really wonder have a greater sense of confidence in the numbers as they truly are?
I want to host a debate on this. So actually, and I haven't had a chance to tell them, so I'm getting out in front. But like, I would like, our school finance lead is Jen Sheese. She used to run the budget office in Texas. She's just very deep. She's been involved in a number of the states where you've seen like substantial finance reform the last few years. She's just outstanding on this. I would like to see her and Ladner have a debate about it, and I would love to host that debate. And so, like,
that'd be great.
I'm previewing that here, which if they're listening will be a shock to both of them because I haven't raised it with either. That's the debate that I actually want to see to start to shed some light on this. They're both serious people, and I think also would if given the opportunity to talk through this with some caveats, I think you'd get to a real nuanced discussion. I don't think it'd be like a food fight kind of debate. I think it'd be very thoughtful.
Well, I think that it would be good to get to the bottom of these things and to have like some general ideas. If you're in a place like Arizona and your ESA and voucher credit is going to be $7,500 a kid, and the state is spending $12,000. And that you can now just start to have some rules of thumb about, okay, how many kids need to leave the public school system funded at $12,000 to take the $7,500 option in order to pay for the new kids that had previously had their entire private education paid for by their parents. It seems like this is just simple algebra here.
Well, but what are they? If they're using tax credits, there's savings in the case of Arizona. That's where it gets a little tricky. And then also, as you know, the schools, we talk about this like it's one-to-one. It's not. The schools have fixed costs and overhangs and so forth. And so it all ends up being messier than you hear in the public debate.
Well, the other thing too is, well, I still think that there's an algebra answer here to what is the overall effect on the state budget, just the state budget. Are they spending more in aggregate on education? Yes or no. But then there's the second thing, which is, okay, who would be benefiting? Are there very many families that would voluntarily give up essentially a $12,000 voucher to stay in the public school system to get $7,500 for a private school. What families are really going to be doing that? It would seem intuitive that it's going to be people at the higher end of the SES ladder that are going to be benefiting from that. And, that should be another part of the understanding here.
I saw a study. I haven't had a chance to look at it, from Pennsylvania, and I haven't had a chance to get into it in any depth, so I can't in any way, comment on the methods or anything else or how robust it is. But it indicated that the demographics there were more diverse and surprising than you might think. Again, I want to dig into that and see what's behind that. But it was interesting. The headline, it was interesting enough that I put it in my pile of things I want to read.
All sorts of stuff to dig into. I'm glad you guys are diving into it. I think it's a really
we'd actually like to do a big evaluation project on it. We're talking with a partner right now about trying to think about what are creative ways to answer this question. I know there's some other folks. I know Doug Harris down in New Orleans is thinking about this. There's a few folks are going to think because it's going to take some creative approaches to get at it. But it's important. I think we want to, and it's going to be one of those things where Jay Green used to do this a lot, where you just have to be the first person across the barbed wire with methods that may not be in an ideal world what you'd want, but are the best you're going to be able to do in the context. Yeah, and just be like, what can we know? And there's going to be a ton of caveats, but I think we need some work like that here.
Well, I think there are these macroeconomic issues that we should be looking at more. I don't know if you saw the post that I sent last weekend with the chart of the century in there. And the chart of the century basically showed how, well, first of all, hospital stays have had inflation rates at just unbelievable levels. Just below that is the cost of higher ed. And one of the others that's just been way out of control in relative to other parts of the economy has been that housing costs, especially housing purchases. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the economy, like the cost of a TV monitor has fallen off a cliff, technology costs have just dropped, phone costs have just dropped, and so it just puts in repose, the parts of the economy that are least regulated are the ones where you tend to see a lot of the price drops. And a lot of the economy that is most regulated has the worst inflation. And as it so turns out,
those areas you would have thought that, Jed. That's surprising. Wait, you're trying to tell me competition lowers prices? That's revelatory.
but as it turns out, our world. You can say at the chart of the century, say, why are you writing about that at Charter Folk? It doesn't have anything in there about K-12 specifically, nothing about charter schools. But the adjacencies to our work, higher ed and housing, given that we attend schools based upon the place where we live, these parts of the economy are really having a profound effect on our work. And the way that tuition costs got out of control in our country is, I know there's a lot of argument here, but it's inarguable. The guaranteed student loans for everyone, regardless, your income level, just allowed higher ed to basically raise their rates to a level that, was whatever they could coax their students into borrowing. And that's how inflation just got completely out of hand.
And also to substitute in the aid package to take what aid they were getting and then push their institutional aid up the food chain, the economic food chain. It was the distorting effects are and we're constantly asked to pretend that this wouldn't be the case, which is it would be highly unusual if this wasn't the case, because it would run against everything we understand about how this stuff how we would expect this to work. And it was all kinds of distorting sorts of effects. And there's a guy named Art Hopman who did a lot of work on the substitution issues and was sort of basically blackballed out of the higher ed world as a result. People just didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of talk now about the importance of voc ed, and we've touched upon that previously. But the subtext there is people are comparing the value of voc ed to what the cost of higher ed is. But when higher ed's economics have been basically warped by this out of control inflation, it makes you have a different calculation than we would otherwise. And I didn't know until I started writing that thing, just poking around. I had never even heard of the Western Governors University. And it's the biggest university in the country, right?
Yeah, and the history of it, it's kind of an interesting regional cooperation. It probably has like lessons and implications for other education issues if we pause to look at it.
Well, one of the things I didn't write about, I should have, or I should have included in there, is when they made the Western Governors universities. Those are not public universities. Those are that they created a nonprofit, and the states have like supported the development of. It's basically a big college charter. It's run as a nonprofit organization supported by states, and that has turned out to be a recipe that has been incredibly successful. They gave out more than 50,000 diplomas last year.
Yeah. I mean, look, the real lesson here, we've talked about a little bit. We actually had a Virginia State board meeting, talked about it with some students recently. It came up is like program and degree matter more than school at this point. But people still like just, we're so attracted to the brand names and so forth. But it's like, what are you actually studying? And the feds have tried to put out some data on this to help people see that, but it hasn't really penetrated. And look, if you want to study, if you want to go to Harvard and you want to study, critical theory or sociology or whatever, that's fine. Go for it. If that's your passion, people should follow their passion, but people should be aware of like, what the ROI and all that stuff looks like. And likewise, some credential programs are great and some are not. We need to be communicating that better and helping kids navigate that as well. We've done a lot of work on that at Bellwether.
Well, the other piece is just the housing costs. And during COVID, to have seen that 88% of house purchases in 2022 were executed by white people, right? Yeah. Now down to 81%. Oh, woo, we've made progress, right? It just shows who has the economic might to be able to get to the house purchases that they want, where they can, and meanwhile, who are the people?
Black home ownership is rising, and the black middle class. There is some good news there as well. And if you're always going to have a higher percentage of whites because there's just more white people in this country. But there is some good news there. There's obviously also when you break down and you look at people who are descendants of slavery in America, there's like enormous wealth gaps that should require our greater attention than they get.
Well, 81% of purchasers are white, 58% of American residents, are resident.
Yeah, no, there's a gap. I'm not arguing there's not a gap, but there's some good news buried in there.
And the strongest opponents to charter schools tend to be, white progressives who have enough money to go and buy themselves houses in the burbs. So, I mean, it's
right,
just,
who move to these places. Yeah, no, I think long term, as it forces changes in either do we go to higher density or do people move out and you get more sprawl? What are the effects of that on education policy? I think there's like a bunch of dimensions to that. It's quite interesting.
Well, you had mentioned that you'd seen a new study out of Denver, and I hadn't even heard of it yet. Tell me what it is that you saw there. Oh. I think Denver and Colorado and the broader, that's where I grew up. What's the latest findings here?
Yeah, and I was just out there this last weekend hosting a small group, and so this was sort of front and center thinking about this. This guy named Parker Baxter. He's at the University of Colorado, Denver, runs a really fantastic policy center there. He's worked in the district, just one of these, really great low-key people in education. And, he did a study a couple of years ago that showed some gains, but there was some methodological limitations. And it was a little, and as he acknowledged, it was a little difficult to parse out. Are these like demographic changes in the city and enrollment changes that are driving what looks like improvements, or their actual improvements? So he went back, he got student level data. The district fought him on it. So it's important, like this, it shows how the power there has shifted. You had Michael Bennett, Tom Boasberg, Susan Cardova, who are like these like reformers who wanted to see the district, and the current leadership in the district didn't want, they literally didn't want him to have access to this data, which is like, it's crazy that the sort of lack of curiosity about or concern that somebody might make an inference somewhere. Which we see a lot. It's not just there, but he got the data, was able to look large scale study. I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I think like 40,000 kids. He was able to make sure they'd been in the district for a couple of years, able to follow them to student level data, and found really substantial effect sizes, differing effects by demographics and certain subpopulations. But overall strong effects and really encouraging effects with some groups of kids is a lot. They will drop some links to the study and to media accounts in the show notes. And I think what's like, it's one of these things that like these reforms were super controversial. The school board there has been highly contested, and the results come in on this reform approach, and it's like the train has kind of moved on. It points up a couple of things we've talked about. One, this idea that nothing works, which is like, you know, exactly. It's another example of how something does work. And I just think in terms of this like portfolio approach, stuff that like people like Paul Hill have been talking about just, you know, for a long time. It's important, and the findings are really interesting, and it should be getting more attention than it does. And I feel like, I sound like a broken record, but I feel like in some other fields, you know, medicine or energy or whatever, you know, when you have some good news, it tends to travel a little bit better. And good news just does it. This is an important, this study should be traveling more. The Denver Post did a story on it that was kind of a hatchet job. Like, because there's this whole industry and like, no, this can't be. And like, there's some interesting stuff, and the effect sizes are, I would describe as unusual relative to what we usually see with these things. And so people should want to pay attention.
Well, I really want to dive in. We've done some focus in the last 2 weeks at Charter Folk on Indianapolis. So we had Brandon Brown from My Trust, right? And had a few charter. He wrote a piece. Scott Bess wrote just a couple of days ago. I was out there, visited schools. It's been really interesting talking to Brandon. It isn't in his piece, but it's worth focusing on. In Indianapolis, they have these innovation schools, and the way their state law was done, they have the charter schools in Indianapolis, but then they have these, they're basically, I call them cabins, charters all but in name. They're run by, most of them are run by separate nonprofits.
Trademark.
And they really, yeah. Well, yeah. So, because there are chinos, right? Charters in name only. And then there are cabins, charters all but in name. And it seems as though these Indianapolis schools really are cabins. In Denver, they went forward with something similar, but because they weren't precise in their state advocacy work, I think most would say that I think they're called innovation schools, or I think they're also called innovation schools in Denver, but their autonomies are fundamentally compromised. So I'll be really curious to read this report and see how those schools are doing. Because I think that if those schools had the additional autonomies to make them cabins too, well, then I would feel a greater sense of confidence that the progress that's been made in Denver is going to be locked in.
Yeah, well, remember a few years ago now in Denver, a fascinating group of teachers wanted to take control of their school and be empowered. They felt like they could run it better and wanted to do this, and like the union fought them. And so it was one of those things that like you would think would cause people to pause and be like, maybe something's weird in this field, but you know, in our field, that's just like Wednesday. And so Indianapolis, like I'm obviously a big fan. I was a founding board member of the Mind Trust with Bart Peterson and David Harrison. Ben has just done amazing work there, and just the slow, steady work of moving this along. And Indianapolis, like there's still tons of problems. It's not where it needs to be, but man, the progress is substantial, and should, again, everyone who thinks this is all, you know, hopeless and futile, you know, their work is a compelling example.
Can I ask you, Andy, why
there overall, you know?
I remember Reed Hastings one time talking about school boards being like motherhood and apple pie. You know, there's no way we're ever gonna, you know, be able to move the public off of a reverie for them. But when we look at these large urban school districts across the country, and maybe I have a tick, you know, but I mean, when you see Milwaukee and Chicago, and you see St. Louis, and you see what Denver was recently, and just so many of these cities across the country, the dysfunction of their publicly elected school boards is just so apparent. And then not every charter school is a good charter school. Not every nonprofit's a great nonprofit, but just the stability of a self-sustaining board, a self-perpetuating board, just seems like a fundamentally stronger place from which to achieve excellence for our kids. But, you know, the conversation is always in the opposite direction. No. We should be taking away from these nonprofits their ability to be self-perpetuating and force them to have elections of some kind. Is there anything you can offer here on this?
A couple things embedded there. Like, how do you, like, I just think I find the elected appointed debate like just sort of a sideshow in the sense that there's compelling examples on both sides. Everyone loves appointed boards until somebody they don't like gets appointed, and then they're like, we should like figure a way to change the power structure. I mean, and you see this in a bunch of places. I think, and this is going to sound glib, but like, it's almost like sometimes you just need a palate cleanser. And so when a place isn't working, shifting the governance arrangement can help. It can bring in change. But no one should romanticize any particular governance model, because we've seen plenty of dysfunction with all of those. And it is a little bit like, oh, like things really aren't working. Okay, well, what model do you have? Well, then try the other one. And you shouldn't do like what Chicago's doing is like an incredible overcorrection. They're going to this board. I forget, it's like 27 people, something like that. It's just, and that's absurd. And that you can tell how that's going to go. But like, I don't know that you can, inherently say that elected school boards, these things and people can wield their power in other ways. And, obviously Denver played out through the changes in elected school board, a bunch of political campaigns, but would that political pressure been brought to bear in other venues? Potentially. I do think giving parents choice is a counterweight against this to some extent. You start to build in some dynamism that doesn't exist. Basic reforms that it eludes me that we don't have and that people aren't out there pushing for. School board elections are held at off-peak times. That's by design, so that special interests, the unions, can kind of drive it. They should be held when people are voting for other offices during normal primaries and general elections, like to increase turnout. We shouldn't be doing these crazy firehouse elections or these off-peak or some random day in April. I mean, there's reforms we could make, but I think democracy is messy, and I'm skeptical of the idea that there is any kind of a panacea here.
Well, I wasn't arguing for appointed over elected. I was arguing for self-perpetuating. That's the value of these nonprofit boards. And I just my years at High Tech High, I know for sure that if they hadn't been able to get board members that were deeply committed to project-based learning and the different things that they wanted, if they just had any old board member come on there or one that was elected, all the things that made High Tech High unique or different, they would have compromised on. And it would have sagged back to, the miasmic oneness that Larry talk about all the time. So I feel like
I agree on that point. Yeah.
Well, hey, we're 6 weeks out.
One other thing I guess I'd say about that's worth just pausing on for a moment is this pressure to like get into board governance as a way to hamstring charters is a problem, because it's hard to find those good members who are committed, who have the skills, who have the time. And so to the extent people want to make it like you have to have more and more seats, it just makes that challenge harder and leads to problems. I think charter critics know that. So you need to be thoughtful about how do you make sure these things are publicly accountable, transparent, there's appropriate public input, but where that's not used as a tool to hamstring them.
Well, Minnesota is a cautionary tale for us right now. You probably saw how the Minneapolis Tribune came out with a big, long hit piece against the state sector generally. But one of the things that was highlighted there is that one thing that makes Minnesota's charter school law different than any other state in the country is it's required that all school board members are elected. And so a lot of the most respected players in the country would never set up shop in Minnesota because they can never agree to a governance structure that was so fatally flawed. So governance really does matter. And we have to remember what those things are and make good arguments for them. I think
we don't need to get into it. We can throw that in the show notes. I have not read the article yet. It's on my list, but I will say people out there I respect say there is some quality variance issues. On the other hand, Minnesota has some really fascinating authorizing methods. I think it's a super interesting state with some really compelling examples. So I think it's again, it's one of these ones where there's something for everybody, but serious players in the charter sector there have been around for a long time, are certainly pro-charter, have raised concerns that there are some quality issues.
I'll be writing about it soon, so I'll be curious to see what.
And it's one of these things like, it gets back to these really difficult questions, like how much should we be like, this is not quality if it's a school that parents like, a different kind of pedagogical approach. This stuff's not straightforward. Sorry, you were going something. We want to talk about the national election. The last election or the last discussion, we were talking about Walz and he coming onto the ticket and everything. We're now only 6 weeks out, and
I shared with you in an email in advance of this that, hey, I don't know if I have anything different to say about this presidential election, but now we're only 6 weeks out. Are you seeing any new trends? Anything that's noteworthy as it relates to education?
I think it's what it seems. It's going to be a very close election. Trump probably enjoys some structural advantages relative to the Electoral College. She is certainly having just a sort of wind at her back that any politician would want, and she's running, I think, a pretty smart campaign. We can talk about that. But it's going to be close. My gut sense is it's either going to be he wins by a little or she wins comfortably. And because we just don't quite understand what's happening with the electorate, and do low propensity voters that are hard to poll turn out for him, or is there going to be at the end people are going to break towards her? Because again, it's a weird race. The conventional wisdom is always people are like, well, undecideds break against the incumbent, but like, who's really the incumbent in this race? It's a complicated dynamic. One thing I do think is interesting, and sort of I find interesting in the sense that I'm one of these people who does believe education's like usually the last to get the memo. She's like running pretty hard to the center. She's tossed identity politics over the side. There was just an article in Politico this week, where she's ending sort of identity-based appeals to Hispanic voters, and instead going with aspirational appeals, which a lot of people have been urging her to do, except sort of the activist class that has an interest in a vested interest in various things. And she's running a very smart campaign that way. And I think that's interesting. And so she's, you're not hearing like no identity politics on her. She's cutting against that and so forth. And yet, like in our sector, everybody still like luxuriates in that stuff all the time. And that just, to me, that's an interesting disconnect. I think she is closer to where the country is. I think she has a better thumb on that than perhaps like all the elites in our sector. And that's showing up in how she campaigns. And there's going to be some lessons there. And she hasn't clawed back all the gap with where Biden was in 2020 with different demographic groups, but she's doing better than he was. She's making back ground among Black and Hispanic voters. She's doing very well among white voters. Like she's starting, you could see the glimmers of the coalition she would need to win.
Well, we in education world often get focused on those presidential elections or top of ticket matters, when usually what matters the most is what happens in the legislatures. What's the mix of stuff? And I just saw something, I don't know if it was in Politico or maybe it was in 74 about Arizona. We were talking about Arizona earlier in the voucher program. One thing that's is a real possibility there is that they could have a Democratic governor and both chambers of the legislature controlled by Dems, who would then be determining the future of their ESA and voucher program. In a number of different states right now, there's a possibility for significant chamber shifts. And that's where actually the education policy tire hits the road.
Yeah, well, going back to what we talked about earlier, historically, cost issues have been a potent argument against choice plans. And so you can see that they're going to need a way to go after the choice stuff, and you can see that being the way, and because that's been potent, and so you can see that happening in Arizona, and you've sort of seen Hobbs kind of casting around for a way to go after it while recognizing that it's very popular, and so this could provide that could be an avenue they go. The other thing, like I just think, look, the more states you have with like robust charter sectors and Democrats in the Senate, the better it is.
Yeah,
because it starts to mute the opposition. It's like what we talked about with Tim Walz, where he's obviously no great fan of charters, but he's also like, look, parents are choosing this. This is going on. I'm not going to like upend their lives. He was kind of a responsible governor in that way. And like it is better the more states you have where there's actually a constituent interest in this, like the better it will be in terms of like restoring some sense of at least like equilibrium, even if we can't get to like outright support for charters in the Democratic caucus.
Yeah, I'm really quite interested in the changing tone in charter land. I think things are getting a little bit more positive right now. I think there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen at the top of the ticket and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not sensing in my day-to-day conversations the degree of exhaustion and the degree of almost futility that people were feeling maybe 3 to 4 years ago. And I wonder if it's just a matter of recognizing our own staying power and how unique staying power is in the education world. And maybe to wrap up, we could talk a little bit about one who had as much staying power as anybody that we knew, which is Don Shalvey. He had this event last week, and I had a chance to go there. It was a great thing to see so many people there. But I think the overarching thing was, well, there were so many things to celebrate about Don Shalvey, but it's the staying power. I did see Reed. He walked up and he was just like, Don just stayed in the game for so long. And it's the cumulative impact of staying in the game. I didn't make the connection with Reed in that very moment. But a good thing I immediately was locking on to, and the staying power of charters. We're, well into our 4th decade now. And it's the staying power, our people and the broader, sector itself. But I don't know, you knew Don as well as I did, any new reflections on what, his legacy is?
Well, yeah, I was sad I couldn't be there, but I had a commitment elsewhere. And so I was very sorry. I was very sorry to miss it. Yeah. I mean, look, I think part of it is, I also think it's not just staying power alone. Don also made some big bets early, he bet his career when he left the superintendency to do Aspire. He was willing to bet his whole career. And so I want to make sure he gets credit for the staying power is important, but so is the willingness to take a risk. And my big fear for the sector right now is I'm not sure how many leaders we have who are actually willing to make those, we've talked about it, the Howard Fullers, the Linda Browns, people who were kind of willing to put all their chips in the middle of the table for something that they believed in. And I worry we have a lot of people now who see themselves as the future, CEO or ED of this or that, or the future deputy assistant secretary of this or that. And so they're not and a movement that suffers from that's a movement that's not going to get very far. So I don't want to lose his bravery as well as his staying power. But yeah, I do think there's something to that. I mean, it's the old, half a life showing up. You got to keep showing up. And look, that going back to Denver, the reform critics, they got swept out of the board, and Michael Bennet and Boasberg were, moving an aggressive agenda, but they didn't just and then Susanna, they just didn't go home. They kept showing up and they clawed back. Yeah. And you have to respect that. And I think our folks can be pretty fast to kind of declare mission accomplished or move on or say it's futile or, be a little feckless. And, Don was definitely not any of those things. He was very persistent in a good way, and he had a North Star, and he stayed. He never lost that North Star.
The next month, I'm going back to San Diego. They're going to have a big event for Larry Rosenstock at High Tech High. He's not passed, but his health is not good, and it's a part of the reason why they want to celebrate here. But one of the things, and Don and Larry spent a lot of time together. They did refer to each other as brothers from other mothers. But the one thing that they had, it's because I can remember Larry in my 2nd or 3rd month on the job at High Tech High, because I was go get. It's I wanted to just go really fast on stuff. He's like, look, we will go fast, okay? But people around here, we love our work. We love our work, and we are going to continue loving our work. That is a non-negotiable. And it's just that love of work, that the privilege of being able to work with young people. I mean, all you had to do with be with Larry in the presence of teenagers, and you just saw
Absolutely.
them. And that was the thing that with Don too. It was whatever setting he was in, whether he was with teachers or he was with funders or he was with other or parents or kids themselves. This guy, he had the staying power, but it was no huge. He took his risks. But it was no heavy lift. He loved it, right? And
he was a happy warrior. Yeah.
It's one thing that I think and it's one of the reasons why when I feel, Charterland having a little more oxygen in the room, and I don't feel a sense of dispiritedness to the same degree that I did, last, 3 or 4 years ago. makes me more optimistic, because the only way we're going to
Yeah.
sustain this work is if we continue to enjoy it. And if there's anything that Don reminds us, that he wrote something at Charter Folk, love what you do. And then then 3 days later, he said, Jed, I didn't get everything in there. Can I publish again next week? So I would never do this before. Same contributor, 2 weeks. Love what you do, part 2, right? And so,
well, I think there's an important thing there, Jed, that ties both those. And you're right about Larry. And Larry is hilarious. So many hilarious stories about like he's just like, it's so much fun to be around. Both those guys, though, I think one thing, they knew what they were for and why they're in this business. They weren't just about tearing down. They weren't just like against the unions or against districts or wanting to, abolish this or that. Like they were builders. They were like here. They were for something, and I think that's a big differentiator. That you need like leaders in the sector who actually are for something, have a positive vision in the world that they want to see realized. Almost less matters if you happen to agree with that vision or not, but some sort of positive vision for change rather than just like all these things that you're setting yourself in opposition to or against.
Well, all we got to do is keep going at it and for another 30 years plus, and laughing all the way, and we will have lived up to the example that Larry and Don left for us. But I sure enjoy our time together a lot, Andy.
Yeah, Jed, it was great. I hope, congratulations again on your anniversary. I hope you have a great rest of your trip, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you in person soon.
All right. See you for another one in a month.
Great.
Take care, Andy.
See ya.